Today, really what I'm going to cover is, for those of you who don't, well, we had a little bit of a rundown on IHARF, but we do lots of different types of just what I would like to consider applied research, try to keep it pretty practical. We've got a variety of funding sources. Groups like Sask Wheat and the other commodity groups are a big source of funding, government, of course, and then also some private industry work. So really, I guess what I wanted to cover today is we're just going to look at some of the broader challenges in wheat production here, and then just give you some examples of work that we've done at Indian Head, and also some other work that I think is quite relevant from around the province here as well. So I've got quite a few slides to get through here. As usual, I'm notorious for having too much information in too small of a period, but I think we can get through this and keep us on track for the day as well. So I guess, as you all know, wheat is one of our most economically and, of course, rotationally important crops on the prairies there, and it's not without its production challenges. Those challenges do vary from year to year, and I would argue that the things that are year to year and location to location, and I would argue that a lot of what I cover today is probably a greater issue in wet years, but you know, as we know, the weather's different every year, and hopefully we can break this dry cycle here pretty soon, and maybe we'll be thinking about some of these issues again. So some of the ones, I guess, that I'm going to cover specifically are lodging. Anyone who farms knows that this can affect yield, but a big part of what it affects is your harvest efficiency, maybe some quality parameters there, but just that harvest efficiency is a big factor. The other thing about lodging is it also, I think, influences a lot of the other decisions that farmers make. I mean, it's paramount with variety selection. That's one of the first things that many growers will look at if they're in a region that's affected by lodging. And of course, also maybe your fertility, particularly the nitrogen decisions, seeding rate decisions. These are all things that I think lodging's frequently on the back of our minds when we're thinking about. Protein, you heard this morning why protein is important to meet the high quality standards that Canada is known for. A lot of this is driven by weather, genetics, environment, things like that, but there's some things that we can try to do for management, and certainly lots of questions on this issue in terms of what maybe can we do. And then of course disease. We'll cover a little bit on leaf spot disease, but the big issue there I think that commonly affects a lot of us, particularly again in the wet years, is fusarium head blight. That of course can give you major yield loss, but sometimes more importantly, if it's bad enough, it can have big quality implications, reducing what you get paid for that grain, and if it's really bad enough, you might not even be able to sell that grain. So this is something that I think is always, maybe if not at the forefront of our minds, it's not far behind. So lodging, I don't have a lot on genetics here, and I just do want to point out that really is your first line of defense. So first off the bat, you want to just kind of look at what information is available on the genetics, pick something that's going to be suited for your environment, fits your management, and that's something that's going to go a long ways right off the bat to managing lodging. What we're really going to focus on today here is some of the PGR work. IHARF's been involved doing research with manipulator in particular since back in 2012 was kind of our first taste of this, and we've done quite a bit of work looking at various aspects, just the overall benefits and performance of potentially using a PGR, and then also how that might interact with different management decisions. Is it specific to variety? Do you need to be putting down a whole pile of nitrogen before you start to see a benefit, things like that? What about optimal timing? So we'll cover off just some highlights of a lot of that work. And some of the variety stuff actually comes into it. Usually this is, when I'm talking PGRs, this is kind of what comes up at the very end of my presentation, but I just put it up right up front here, I think, to give you guys a sense of what we've been looking at over the past several years. So this is a 6-year average. 2013 is when we started our fully replicated field trials with plant growth regulators. And this is, averaged across different varieties, different timings of application, different end fertility rates, different seeding rates. There's a lot of, I guess, things that have been going on in the background here, but these are just our overall average responses that we've seen at Indian Head specifically over the past several years. So here we're looking at height. One thing about manipulator, and most PGRs, I think for that matter, I'm not familiar with all the labels, but it's not registered to increase your yield, anything along those lines. It may or may not talk specifically about lodging. What the label really says this product will do is reduce plant height. So those are actually the effects on plant height there. And you can see our overall height has varied a lot from year to year. Variety could be playing into that, but we are very consistently, whether it's wet or dry, getting that reduction in height. This is our effects on yield. So obviously yield is what ultimately pays the bills. Short plants are nice. They get you combining things faster, less prone to lodging, but this is what we've seen for yield responses. And we do see some variation there. No real surprise. It's through some of our wetter years where we tend to see the strongest yield responses. We did have a couple dry ones just to finish things off here. 2017, actually very little lodging, quite dry conditions, still pretty good yield potential. I was surprised to see that much of a yield benefit in that year, but we did. This past year, we had a little bit more precipitation, but the timing was different, and I would say overall we were more drought stressed this past year here. Again, no lodging, and we really didn't see much benefit to the PGR application. You'll recall that we did have a big impact on height just in 2018 there, but that didn't actually translate into any yield benefit. So it's actually good to see more of those, because I hate to oversell really what a product like this will do. And you know, it's almost been too consistent prior to that, and we don't necessarily always see that under field circumstances. But I think this is good evidence that shows if you are in an environment where lodging can occur, you know, this does have pretty strong potential to give you more yield. This is some of the timing work that we did, and also nitrogen fertility. So I'll just kind of walk you through what we're looking at. And this is just an example. We did these trials over a 3-year period here, but 2015 I thought was a year that illustrated our broader results quite well, and was just you know, in the interest of time, a nice little one to look at. So first thing we've got going on is 3 levels of fertility. These are either 100, 125, or 150% of a base rate of, it's actually our base rate was 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen, and then I think 30, 15, 15, P2O5, K2O, and sulfur there. So basically we're going from about 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen as we increase fertility there. That's these bars. So yellow is the lowest fertility, then green would be our moderate rate, and blue the most aggressive. As we move down the other axis, we've got different timings where the PGR was applied. So growth stage 21, that would be really, you know, a few leaves just starting to tiller at that stage, not quite at the stem elongation stage. Growth stage 31 would be early stem elongation. So at that point, we're probably looking at, you know, maybe one node above ground, another one just right at or below the soil surface there. These plants are just starting to stretch. Growth stage 39, we're at the early flag leaf stage. So we're getting close to when we'd be applying a fungicide. Things are stretching. That's the tail end of the window. This is actually a really open label. The label is, I believe the product is registered to be applied anywhere from growth stage 21 all the way to 39. So you've actually got quite a extended period there where you have the ability to use the product. Now, I guess just looking at the performance of some of the different timings, we're looking at height right here, and I'm going to walk you through lodging and yield as well. But we do seem to have some evidence that we aren't getting, and this has been pretty consistent, we aren't getting quite as good an efficacy with that very earliest date in particular. Hasn't always happened at other sites. I mean, for the most part, we're getting a benefit across that entire window. My experience would tell me that, you know, for the most part, that growth stage 31 to even as late as 39 is where we're getting the best benefits. You know, everyone's probably looking at this thinking, well, that 39 looks really good, and that actually has been a consistent performer. One of the challenges there, which I think this is maybe a little bit more theoretical because I've never actually seen it, is that there's been some concern that maybe at that late stage we're not getting quite the lodging protection that we would maybe at earlier stages, just with the recognition that when we apply it later on, we're maybe shortening that stem and thickening it up a little bit higher up the plant than we would be with the earlier applications. So we still have that, you know, highly visible height difference, but maybe don't have the thickening where we want it, which would be right at the base to give us the best lodging protection. I say it's theoretical because we haven't actually seen that. I mean, when we get these kind of results, that's translated into really good lodging protection as well, but something that I know has been discussed at least before. So these are our lodging ratings. You know, these are qualitative measurements here, but basically what we're seeing is the most lodging as we'd expect without a PGR, and that is worse at the higher fertility. Some of the other site years that have done this work, you know, we see almost a linear increase where it just gets a little bit worse every increment that we increase that nitrogen level. Here it really kind of stood out at the highest fertility rate. With that earlier application, we got a pretty good reduction. You know, you're going to see this from the truck driving by at a good speed. It's gonna look better. We can see it maybe breaking down a little bit, pretty negligible as the fertility is increased. But then with those latter 2 application dates, lodging's essentially been eliminated. Those values are 2, but that equates, the way I did the measurements that year, that's no lodging, essentially. They were standing straight up. And when we looked at our yield, it really paralleled kind of what we've seen with the previous 2 measurements there. So all looked pretty good. We did end up with a minimum 5% yield increase. That was at that earliest stage where we maybe didn't see quite the level of height reduction and reduction in lodging that we would have liked to, but still a big improvement. And then these latter 2 were pretty consistent at 10%. Like I say, we've done this work, and we did it in 2013, 14, and 15, these particular trials, with some variation in protocols, and that has been quite consistent. Some of the other work we did, this was actually funded through the province, but we wanted to look at, we did it in 2015, not the worst year for lodging, but we did have high yields and there was some lodging. So here we just took a variety that we knew would lodge. This was Unity wheat, and we applied a full spectrum of nitrogen rates there, right from a control with, it's not quite 0, we got a little bit from our 1152, but about 6 pounds an acre there, right up to 180 pounds per acre at the far end. And lodging wasn't catastrophic that year, but I think you'd see more or less what we would expect to. And here's without the PGR, you can see just kind of a nice linear increase in lodging. Not a complete wreck, but it's noticeable there. And with the PGR, we still have a little bit of slope there, but it did look a lot better. This is what our yield results look like for that particular trial. We just did that the 1 year, but really what this is showing, I would say that, until we got up to about that 80 pound an acre rate, that's where we had probably the biggest spread between our untreated and treated varieties. But we, even at this really modest rate where we weren't anywhere real near maximizing yield yet, we were still getting some benefit there. The only place that we really didn't see any yield benefit was in our control, where we didn't apply any nitrogen fertilizer at all. But obviously that plot's got a lot of issues besides just lodging on its own. Varieties, that's a big one. I kind of opened up just talking. Look at your varieties first right off the bat. So this is the direction that some of the work has been going more recently here over the past several years. Since 2016 is kind of when we started this. Then we did more trials in 17 and 18, but I decided to show 16 because that was the year where we actually had the most lodging pressure. The last 2, it's been pretty dry and things have been standing up nice and straight. But what you'll see here though, so we've got a few different varieties. These are some hard red springs, a couple Durum varieties there in the green, and then that's one of the northern hard reds there, Elgin, we had just that year. The rest of the years we haven't done that. And this is the overall average, but I guess what I would like to show is that we've actually got an interaction here where the effect of the PGR on lodging is varying across varieties, and it's pretty simple if you look at the results. Basically, we've got one variety, Carberry. We've since swapped that out with Brandon, but Carberry, if anyone's grown it or is familiar with Brandon, there's new ones coming on that have similar characteristics, but this is a nice short variety that really stands really well. So it's been popular for a lot of growers, and that's really what we're seeing. No reduction in lodging with the PGR because there was no lodging to begin with. In the varieties that went down, we obviously had some significant improvements. This is what our grain yield response looked like from that same set of varieties there. So averaged across all the wheat varieties, we did pretty good in this trial, 2016, a 15% yield increase. And even in Carberry, the one I had pointed out where we had no lodging, no benefit to that, we did still have some yield benefit. And I can't necessarily do justice in explaining where that might have come from. But I would point out, I think, and this is intuitive, that that's our smallest yield increase of the bunch here. So I think that tells us, which again really isn't rocket science, but we have the most to gain with varieties that are likely to lodge. Not to say that you won't potentially see a benefit to using a PGR with a variety with excellent lodging resistance, but it's likely to be smaller than you would within one that's going down. And here we're just talking yields. I have had a lot of farmers even come to me and say, honestly, I don't even really care if it affects yield. If it can get me going through that field more efficiently with the combine and getting acres done in a day and not putting as much straw through, that in itself is maybe enough to justify the added input cost. And I don't disagree with that. I think maybe that's a little bit of an individual decision there. But some years that can certainly have a lot of value. We've had a few. 2016 was one of them where if you weren't done combining by about the 3rd of October, you took 6 weeks off. So, things like that can have some value. This is just a little bit more. This is from one of Mike Hall's sites at Yorkton with ECRF. You might be familiar with some of the work that he's done, but I thought this really just illustrated the variety issue quite well. So he had two varieties here. This is back in 2015. He either had Good Eve or Unity. Good Eve was his more lodging resistant variety relative to Unity, which we do have lots of experience from when we first started working with this, and does lodge a fair bit and responded quite well. But you can see he had, I guess, significantly different or less spread in the amount of lodging that he saw with that variety that had improved resistance. And that also translated into pretty big differences in the yield there, which I think is, again, maybe what we won't see every single year, but what makes sense and what we would expect to see. So in his variety that didn't really lodge a heck of a lot, really good results still. He had a 9% yield increase. But you look at Unity, which did go down, there he gained over 20% of his yield. You're not going to get numbers like that every year, but this just, I think, really does illustrate that quite well. Everything that we did there was a standalone application. There is, obviously, for good reasons, a fair bit of interest in tank mixing. And, I think that there's opportunities to do so, but you would want to at least be prepared to do a standalone application here. So, where I think it would maybe fit quite well with, where it would maybe fit a little bit better is, say you got a good burn off, maybe you're using a residual herbicide, maybe it's not raining, you don't have a lot of weeds early on in the season, you can afford to wait until getting towards the tail end of that herbicide application window. You're probably entering a point now where you're at a good stage for the PGR application and would be able to do a tank mix. Engage Agro, or now Belcham, I guess, they do have a lot of information on this. They've done a lot of compatibility testing, things like that, some in cooperation with the University of Alberta. So you may always want to check with them. They can even give you a little guide, I think, that has all the products that they've tested, just to show if there's any compatibility issues. To my knowledge, they haven't identified any. The other end of that is your flagleaf fungicide application, if you choose to do that. And there I would be a little bit more leery about planning to tank mix with the fungicide, just because usually when we're spraying tank, when we're spraying flagleaf, we're waiting for those flag leaves to be pretty much fully unrolled, on our main stems. Tillers are coming along nicely. When we were applying these products, we're really just main stem flag leaves just starting to emerge. So we're really at the opening of probably a little bit ahead of what I would consider an optimal fungicide timing. So with protein, well, I had mentioned before that, obviously genetics is a big one, and of course environment are the two things that really dictate where your protein kind of falls. Outside of that, we can manage it to a certain extent with nitrogen fertilizer. So this section is really going to just be all about, nitrogen management and some of the work that we've seen. I guess I'll show you results from a couple years here of what we call just our 4R or nitrogen management in wheat trials. We did this with canola as well, exact same protocols, but I'll just run through the treatments again. I think this is fairly interesting. So here's our control, of course, where no nitrogen was applied. Now this is all side-banded urea, where we've got the green bars there, ranging from a half to 1.5x rate. Our 1x was 116 pounds N per acre soil plus fertilizer there. So, if you had 20 pounds in the bank, it'd be just shy of a 100-pound rate. And we go up to 150 there in that case. Now when we get into these pink bars, this is all a spring surface application. We've got one liquid product there that was a surface dribble band. Everything else is granular, just broadcast right around the same time as seeding there. It was a dry year, recall, so that's going to come back to haunt us. That fertilizer got left on the surface and didn't get washed in. Finally here we've got some split applications where we basically half of the nitrogen was side-banded urea at time of seeding. The other half we came in at about 5-6 leaf stage of the wheat here and did a surface broadcast of, again, either urea, UAN, Agrotane, or Super U were the treatments that we were looking at. So we'll go through it reasonably quickly, but so here's just our N rate response for yield 2017. So pretty strong response there. You can see actually yields climbed right up to that highest rate of nitrogen. And if we look at protein, this is very typical. You pretty well always need more nitrogen to maximize protein than you do to maximize yield. So you can see odds are we didn't even get there. This is actually a curvilinear response, but it looks pretty much like a straight line, and that's not too unusual, especially in a year where we're getting big yield responses like that to our nitrogen. Now when we look at the different nitrogen management strategies, so the placement, form, timing strategies, this is our yield. You can see 2017, it really didn't matter. Here's kind of the one that we want to beat. This is side-banding urea at time of seeding. No matter what else we did, our yields were actually quite consistent. I would say looking at that, everything worked pretty well. But remember, protein's more responsive. And when we looked at that, That's what we saw. So we really couldn't beat getting that, regardless of what the form was, getting that nitrogen down in the soil at time of planting is, usually about as good as we can expect to get in our short growing season. But this is a dry year, and under those circumstances, that was by far where we did the best. If we would have had a lot of rain to move that nitrogen into the soil, maybe also put this side-banded urea at a higher risk of loss throughout the season, we could have seen quite different results. But in a dry environment, this is pretty typical. This is something that we see pretty regularly. None of that surface applied nitrogen really had a good shot at getting washed in. The stuff that we put down at seeding didn't see rain for almost 6 weeks. Basically then it was wet for a few days anyways, dried up. When it dried up enough, we got out and put down our split application treatments, and then it never rained again. So, both of these just were in a bad situation. Oh. So 2018, we continued kind of a similar project. We tweaked it up a little bit, just wanted to look at a few different things. So now this is all side-banded again, all of our green bars. We've got 3 rates there again, just like we did the previous year, 0 to 1.5x. And then we took multiple forms and either side-banded. These treatments went down in the fall now, so this was a fall surface application or a fall in-soil band. So same equipment that we used for seeding, just went out there in the fall though instead and actually got it into the ground. There's our yield response, not near as strong as the previous year. Yields were a little bit lower, still pretty strong, but you can see no significant difference in yields really from our half rate all the way to the 1.5. Protein, of course, is stronger, but not quite like we saw the previous year. Now at this point here, we're not getting too much difference between that 1 to 1.5x rates. Here's our different strategies. Once again, there is some noise here, a bit of up and down, but very few of these are statistically significant. It looks like we've got a slightly lower yields, and actually we would if we group these together by placement timing options. We would have slightly lower yields with that fall surface broadcast. When we got into the fall in-soil application or side banding, things performed pretty similarly. That's for yield. When we look at protein, it's not quite as dramatic as the previous year, but we still do have a slight significant, especially when we look across all those different forms there, advantage to the side banding as opposed to that fall application. But the fall in-soil band still looks pretty darn good. Where we did tend to lose was with that fall surface application. One little kind of catch there, I guess, if we look at that fall surface application, you can see we had a little bit of a benefit to using the super urea with that timing and placement option. And that actually popped out with the canola as well from the same year, so that was pretty consistent. So we were getting some benefit there. This is a new project, that's one that actually Mike Hall led, and we ran this one through Saskatchewan here. They administered the project in a bunch of AgriArm sites and helped fund it, I believe, and then a bunch of the different AgriArm sites ran trials for this. And what we really wanted to drill down here was looking at some late season, particularly foliar is something that we were interested, applications of nitrogen and their effect on yield, and more importantly, I think, with some of these strategies, protein. That's a question that certainly came up after 2017. A lot of people had high yields, maybe lower protein that they would have liked to see regardless of what they used for nitrogen rates at seeding. So this was a question that came up a lot. Is there anything we could have done to boost that later in the season? And applying again late in the season, sometimes directly to those leaves as opposed to soil is something that I think growers have historically looked at for, up to 30 years here now. This isn't necessarily something new, looked at as a way to increase protein. So our trial that we did here was really quite straightforward. It looks kind of busy with these treatments, but basically we've got 2 background fertility levels, either 70 or 100 pounds of nitrogen as kind of our side banded urea. And then we added another 30 pounds either as a surface dribble band prior to the boot stage, so a little bit earlier in the season, kind of late vegetative growth stages. And that was a surface dribble band, so targeting the soil more so than the plants. And after that, we waited until that crop was done flowering, fungicides were all applied, and we either applied that 30 pounds again as a surface dribble band or put on the flat bands that we use for herbicides and tried to just hit all the heads, hit the leaves. That was our foliar application. We did that at 2 N levels. I don't have all the sites listed there. I do have another slide. I think we had 7 locations on average is what we ended up with there. So it was just about all of the AgriArm sites essentially. So throughout the province, very representative of the province as a whole in that particular year, 2018. What we're looking at here, so I guess it's a little bit hard to read these numbers, but this is really the one to beat right here. This is where we put down the same total rate of nitrogen as all of these guys, but it all went down as side banded at seeding. This was our early surface dribble band of the extra 30 pounds. This was our foliar application post-anthesis. This was our surface dribble band post-anthesis. And this is at the 70 pound per acre base rate, so the lower of the two base rates. And I guess, you know, in its simplest terms, what it's really showing is that once again, it's really hard to beat getting that extra nitrogen down in a band at the time of seeding, at least in a dry environment, with both yield and protein. The protein are our little X's there, and this is our yield. So you can see we have the highest yield and equal or better protein with putting everything down at seeding. This is our 100 pound per acre base rate, and really the patterns are virtually identical there essentially. So this is our one to beat here. You know, the numbers aren't just perfect, but we're, you know, at least equal to the highest yield of the other treatments. None of this is statistically significant. And then same thing with our protein. Our protein is as good or better with putting everything down at planting. Once again, I really can't stress the importance of environment. You know, even with this whole 4R nutrient stewardship, that's great. Right place, right form, right time, right, what am I missing here? Rate. You know, these are things that universally apply to every fertilizer decision you make. But a key thing about the 4R nutrient management recommendations is that they're site specific and they're objective specific. So, you know, I think you really have to look at your weather. We can't always predict it. You have to really look at what are you trying to achieve. Is it yield or protein? And go from there. And the results can vary from year to year. So unfortunately, until we get that crystal ball, there's always going to be some uncertainty. Individual site data for basically showing the same thing. So you know, it's going to be hard for you to see, but those blue numbers, this is yield, are where we put everything down at time of seeding. And for the most part, those are as good or better than anything else we're looking at. Some exceptions over here, you know, you can see Swift Current. We've got some funny stuff going on, but they had some really tough conditions with the dry. It looks like they had a little bit of a higher yield. Whether or not that was statistically significant, though, I don't think that it was with that late season in soil application. So I think that's probably more just noise than anything. And this was our results with protein here. So again, you know, other than a few exceptions where maybe things are popping out, looking like a little bit of an improvement. Swift Current, the one where I showed you the low yields, that was one where it looked like our foliar application was maybe giving the most protein. But by and large, you know, those blue bars, once again, are looking pretty good throughout. So it tends to, like I say, results can really vary, but what I find, banding nitrogen beneath the soil surface at seeding is just very robust. I mean, it's going to work well for you in most circumstances, whatever Mother Nature brings you for weather. A lot of the alternatives can work really well for you, but they don't always, just depending on what we get for weather. So I guess, you know, and some of this might come down to risk management. If you suffered a drought last year, you're looking at another drought this year, maybe you don't want to put down 120 pounds of nitrogen, right? Something like that. So there's different ways to look at it as well. You know, I guess you could say this may tell you that you can cut that back a little bit and still have some time to make that decision later in the season too. So, you know, that's another way to look at it. I just wanted to point out, you know, this isn't necessarily a new concept. Guy Lafond, who I worked very closely with early in my career, he's got work on this going back to the early 90s, and they found that, yes, they could increase protein with a reasonable amount of certainty, or I guess consistency. The economics were pretty marginal in most cases in a lot of that work. This is right when I was first coming onto the research farm there. Bill May got this project going, and that was with four different varieties of durum there at Swift Current and Indian Head. And this was a pretty big, complex study looking at a whole bunch of different things. But for this particular component, he started out with a modest nitrogen rate, so 75% of their soil test recommendations, and then added one of three rates, either at seeding as banded, you know, side banded, 5-leaf stage, and that's a surface dribble band, UAN. This was urea up here. Everything else is surface dribble banded UAN. At the 5-leaf stage, at the flag leaf stage, or anthesis. So pretty, you know, a lot of similarity with what we did just this past season. But this was a fairly big multi-year study. So this is kind of what this is a few sites. He had some interaction. So at 3 sites, this is basically what he saw here. And once again, this is averaged across all the different rates that he top dressed. But you can see that green bar is where we put that extra nitrogen down with the drill. Once again, you know, and we're just looking at protein here, but that's what was giving him the protein. We had a couple years where the response differed a little bit, but the conclusions really didn't. They were still getting the best results, or as good a result as anything else, by getting it down at seeding. So here's his 3 different rates. This is all at seeding. This is all at 5-leaf stage. This is all at flag leaf, and all at flowering. So once again, you know, there were There were cases where they met the protein that they achieved getting that nitrogen down at seeding, but they really never improved upon it. That was Swift Current in 2002. So some pretty dry environments here. Swift Current 2003 was another year where they had a little bit of interaction, but once again, the seeding was quite hard to beat, especially at those more aggressive rates. That's where it really jumped out. These are at his highest couple of rates, and you can see that, you know, any of these later applications or split applications, the protein never got to near what they saw there. Once again, dry year, dry environment. So this is one that we just did this year, and there's a couple things I just kind of wanted to show. So this is why I just called it the wheat input demonstration, but all we're really doing is we wanted to look at individual, or I guess contributions of individual inputs to yield, protein, a whole bunch of other, you know, yield parameters and quality parameters, things like that. But the things that we varied were seed treatment, seeding rate, fertility, that was everything, but we're going to focus on nitrogen, a PGR application, and a fungicide. And we either had our low input, which wasn't no input, it was still pretty good, well-managed wheat, but low input, versus our high input, where basically we threw everything at it. It got it all, the high fertility, the fungicide, the PGR application, higher seeding rate. You know, we did everything we could for that crop. I'm just going to show you yield and then protein here. So here's our yield. So here's our low input versus our high input. We got a bit of a spread there, not a huge amount. Then from there, I'm just going to draw your attention, I guess, over to these bars where we actually did have some significant effects. So first thing that increased yield was fertility right here. You know, it wasn't a huge amount, but we got a boost with just a little bit higher fertility. And remember, this isn't, you know, treated versus untreated. This is something along the lines like 110 pounds versus 80 pounds, whatever those numbers are. But like, this wasn't a no input crop. It was a pretty well managed crop. Our PGR and our fungicides, somewhat surprising to me that we saw that response, but those gave us a yield benefit as well just this past season. This was pre-veil wheat, I believe. We picked something that, you know, did have some potential to go down and not maybe the strongest fusarium package, things like that. When we look at our protein, I guess number one, what we can see is that the only input that we can really vary here that's going to have any impact, any positive impact on protein is that higher fertility, and that's exactly what we saw there. But the other thing I want to draw your attention to is the other two inputs that weren't fertility that increased yield, and that's PGR and fungicide. And you can see it wasn't huge, but basically if we increase yield without adjusting N or with anything besides nitrogen, you get a dilution effect there, protein's going to come down. And it's, like I say, it's not huge, but that's exactly what we have happening here, where, you know, with our fungicide application on its own, PGR application on its own, we were reducing protein and not getting it back. The only thing that got it back was fertility, and when we threw everything at it, we still had pretty good protein, but not quite as high as there, but we did have higher yields over here as well. So disease, we better keep on moving here. So we're on to the last stretch here. Some of this I'm going to actually present a bit of work that came out of Randy Kuchar's lab, and I'll complement that with some work that we've done at Indian Head as well. So hopefully I can cover off the major issues for you quite well. You know, diseases, I think we've all dealt with either leaf disease or fusarium at some stage of our lives if we've been growing wheat, especially the Durum growers. So first we'll look a little bit, kind of more of a focus on the, I guess, timing of application, and we're looking at leaf spot disease here. So maybe not the first thing on your mind, but this is some work that was out of Randy Kuchar's lab here. But basically they were just looking at our control, no fungicide application. I'm going to show you both leaf disease ratings and yield impacts. Here's our flag leaf application, our anthesis application, and this is both. It's getting sprayed at both flag leaf and anthesis. Now we've got two things going on. Our blue bars were a high disease environment. Our orange bars were a low disease environment. And this is pretty intuitive. Basically what it's showing us is that in a low disease environment, we're getting essentially all of the leaf disease protection that we need from either one of those fungicide applications. But it's that later one that's going to protect your yield as well. So really what it's showing in a low disease environment, and I think most of us probably know this, really no need to spray it twice. And you're going to get probably as much yield benefit, as much protection of leaf disease as you need with that later application that's really targeting fusarium. But every product registered fusarium is also registered to control leaf spot diseases. It's the timing that isn't always optimal. And under a heavy disease pressure year, you know, you can see that we do have some benefits to basically going with both of those application timings. But you got to justify it, so that comes down to, you know, lots of scouting early in the season. His yield results really, for the most part, paralleled this quite well. you can see at our high disease environment, a little bit lower yields overall, but basically incremental increases with each of those fungicide applications, and the highest yields with a dual application. Low disease, probably should have just gone fishing instead of pulling the sprayer out. Even though we did have some visual effects on leaf disease there, it didn't translate into a yield benefit for any of the timings, and certainly not a dual application. This is something that I guess just kind of complements this from work that we've done at Indian Head. So this is just 3 years, not necessarily all the same trials, but where we've looked at all of these different timings, and it shows pretty similar results. 2013, lower disease pressure year. We actually got our best bet, or best bang for our buck with that application at anthesis, and no benefit to the dual application. Both 2014 and 2016 were wetter. We had a lot more disease, and those were years that we actually did get, you know, some, for the most part, statistically significant benefits to getting out there and spraying twice. So it really just comes down to scouting and having a good sense of what your pressure is. This is some work that was more focused on fusarium that we also did at Indian Head. This was from 2015 with Durum. We're not Durum country. You know, we tend to have too much disease to grow Durum, at least through the wetter years. Some years we get away with it. But basically here I was just looking at some different combinations of seeding rates, either 200, 300, or 400 seeds per square meter, or foliar fungicides. So none of this got sprayed at the flag leaf, just as background info. But then from there, I either came in and sprayed at early heading, so we were looking for about 75, 85% of our heads emerged right at the opening of that label window for spraying for fusarium. Our next one here, we're looking for 50% anthesis, which I would consider is a window of about a day, but the optimal time to get out there and spray, but it just is a short window is the challenging part. And then of course a dual fungicide application. And these are two spray operations that are happening within, it was probably 3 or 4 days of each other. So you know, the sprayer barely cooled off and we were back out there hitting it again. And that was just the way the crop developed in that year. So going through our results here, this is our grain yield, and I guess what I'll point out first is our individual bars within a group of different colors. Those are our different seeding rates, 200 on the left, 400 on the right. You can see, and then here I've got kind of letter groupings to describe what we saw. No benefit to the different seeding rates on grain yield. Strong yield increases to the fungicide applications, and all of them. Basically, we got a significant response to that earlier application, which in my opinion was a little bit ahead of the optimal stage. An even better response at what I would call the optimal stage, 50% anthesis, the best response, and this was all additive. Basically, it just kept on, you know, adding one onto the other with that dual application. Pretty surprising to me, you know, and this wasn't a tremendous disease pressure year either. 2015 we had moisture, but it wasn't excessively wet. But this is Durum as well, which, like I say, we're not necessarily a prime environment for that. I did some just visual fusarium head blight incidence rating. So this is just going out and counting the percentage of heads out of 50 per plot that actually had some level of fusarium on them. And you can see here that we were seeing some benefit to the higher seeding rates. So our two highest seeding rates had less just visible fusarium out in the field. Certainly our fungicides were helping a lot with what we could actually see out in the field. But then we're going to jump ahead. I don't have Dawn, unfortunately, but I do have, this is a third-party lab did fusarium damage kernels for us. And this was kind of interesting. And basically what this showed is that our seeding rates, even though they had no impact on yield, actually appeared to have more effect on quality than the fungicides themselves. You know, and it's pretty subtle. I wouldn't say that this is a real strong benefit, but particularly at, you know, here's in the absence of fungicide, at the highest seeding rate, we can see quite a difference there in fusarium damage kernels. All are pretty bad, you know, none of this is pretty Durum, that's for sure. What else can I point out? I would speculate, I think, that some of the difference in what we're seeing in terms of grain quality versus visual fusarium out in the field was probably due to a lot of those really bad, really white, affected, shriveled up kernels just not even making it into our sample. You know, they were probably going out the back of the combine. If they didn't go out the back of the combine, you know, they might have got taken out as dockage, because this is all getting done after the dockage measurements as well. So I think that's probably where, you know, why we're maybe not having quite the impact that we'd like to on quality with the fungicide applications. Last couple slides. So this is some work also out of Randy's lab here, and I think this is really important because this is showing interactions between genetic resistance and then foliar fungicides, and you know what one can do versus the other, and I guess how the two might interact. So this was pretty interesting. And here he's looking at Dawn, and this is, I like Dawn because it's a good quantitative measurement that, we can't necessarily screw up quite as easily as maybe some of the grading, the more visual assessments. But what he's showing is basically that some of these resistance genes are obviously reducing DON in the wheat, just what we would expect here. I forget how many sites he had this average here, but it was several sites anyways. Some variation there, but this is genetic resistance alone. This would be the average of sprayed and unsprayed plots. Over here was across all of those varieties, sprayed versus unsprayed. So he is getting benefit to both. By spraying that crop with the fungicide at a good time, they're getting less DON there, but a big part of it is the genetics. So, that's really important. When we looked at actual fungicide efficacy, so like just percent control versus their moderately susceptible genetics versus some of the resistance ones, they found some interesting results as well. So actual incidence wasn't really affected. That's the percentage of infected kernels that they see out in the field. They didn't see much difference in the benefit to fungicide, whether they're using resistant or non-resistant varieties. But where it did start to show up is everything else, essentially. With a non-resistant variety, they were getting a little bit more of a reduction in severity with fungicide. Index, this is just kind of like an overall fusarium average for the entire plot or field is how you would look at that. DON, which of course I like because it's quantitative, and then yield. So basically, more to gain with a fungicide application with susceptible varieties. But the two aren't necessarily independent for each other. If you really want to manage the disease and really want to ensure the best quality, you need to start with the best genetics and then still not rule out a fungicide application, I think is the big message here. You may or may not need it, but you want to be ready to apply it because we kind of need all the tools that we can to, I think, really battle this disease in high pressure years in particular. We should be on to the last slide. So just kind of a quick recap. When it comes to lodging, your first line of defense, once again, is PGRs, is a variety selection. So take a good look at that. And like I said before as well, lodging resistance of varieties can often affect some of our other decisions. Most importantly, probably nitrogen management and seeding rates. The PGRs have proven to be a really effective tool. So, I think you can look at those as something that's available to you and may or may not have a good fit on your farm. They've come with consistent yield benefits. There's big potential to improve harvest efficiency. And another thing, I think it gives just growers a little bit more flexibility to maybe look at varieties that they wouldn't have otherwise grown, or also just, maybe manage the crops more intensively than they otherwise would have because they're afraid to go down. And not that that's always going to be economical, but it gives options, I think, and I like that. Options are good. Protein, aside from genetics and environment, it's just all about nitrogen. So that's really all you can do. The optimum N rate for protein is generally, I'll probably say pretty much always higher than required to optimize grain yield. You need more nitrogen to get the protein, so depends whether or not you're getting paid for that protein, whether or not it makes sense to apply for that highest rate. Other inputs that increase yield besides nitrogen do have potential to dilute that protein and bring it down, so just be aware of that. And I guess we haven't seen consistent benefit to enhanced efficiency products. We've done a lot of that work. They can provide benefits under the right conditions, basically when you've got conditions for loss. If you're using suboptimal timing or placement options, this is a real good fit just to, reduce some of the risks associated with that. But all in all, it's been really hard to beat banning everything at the time of seeding. If you're looking at alternatives, it's probably not agronomic, it's probably more logistic. And that's okay. We do a lot of things in farming in Western Canada for logistic reasons as well. But the agronomy usually favors in-soil applications and as close to time of uptake as possible. Disease, unless your early season pressure is high, usually spraying for fusarium will provide adequate leaf control, but scouting is important, of course. Higher seeding rates do appear to at least have potential to reduce the negative impacts on quality. And when that happens, it's going to come either from a narrower infection window. Basically, we've just got less tillering and that crop as a whole is sensitive or susceptible to fusarium for a shorter period of time. Or the other thing that it might do is just get the field more uniform and make it easier to get out there and apply the fungicide at the right time because you don't have quite as much variability to try to sort out. And I guess the big thing, again, integrated approach is required. I would strongly encourage you to start with the best genetics you can. So, we're going to hear more about varieties as they're coming out and they keep on making improvements with fusarium. Use that technology. but don't necessarily put the sprayer in the shed and expect to leave it there. You know, I think there are still going to be cases where a fungicide is warranted, and you know, that's good. They are effective for their purposes that they're intended for, but I guess look at that as your last line of defense, and for the most part, a fungicide alone isn't necessarily going to save you if you have serious disease and quality issues. So.